The church mouse quits within a week. $50. Dr. Sterling's voice carried across the nurse's station during shift change, loud enough for the entire department to hear, loud enough for Hannah Clarke to hear while she organized medication charts 3 feet away. She didn't flinch. She didn't look up. Her hands remained steady as she aligned the folders with the edge of the counter, precise as a surgical instrument finding its mark. Around her, the other nurses exchanged glances, the kind of quick eye contact that meant trouble was coming, the kind that said Dr. Sterling had already decided who she was and how long she'd last. Hannah had been at Sacred Heart Hospital in Denver for exactly 3 months. 3 months of early shifts and double rotations, 3 months of keeping her head down and her mouth shut, 3 months of burying everything that made her dangerous. The hospital smelled like every hospital smelled, antiseptic and stale coffee and the faint metallic undertone of blood beneath the bleach, and she'd learned its rhythms the way she'd learned the rhythms of 3 different military bases, by observing, by listening, by knowing where every exit led. She was 38 years old. Her driver's license said her name was Hannah Clarke. Her nursing credentials from the University of Colorado said she'd graduated 4 years ago. None of that was entirely untrue, and all of it was constructed to exist in the world without raising questions. Quiet competence. That's what the hiring manager had called her during the interview. Steady hands. Precise attention to detail. The ability to remain calm under pressure. All true. All built on a foundation the hiring manager would never know about, the kind of foundation that came from having held a field hospital together for 36 hours while mortars impacted 200 yards away, from having extracted 17 hostages from a compound in Fallujah while bullets punched through corrugated metal walls, from having carried the weight of decisions that cost lives or saved them. The combat boots were in her locker on the 3rd shelf, hidden beneath her spare scrubs. Leather so cracked and worn it looked like a topographical map of desert terrain. The kind of boots you couldn't throw away because throwing them away felt like abandoning pieces of yourself. She touched them sometimes when nobody was looking, just her fingers on the worn leather, just a moment of acknowledging that Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke had existed once, in a different life, under a different name, in a place where her hands had held guns instead of medication syringes. Dr. Sterling arrived during morning rounds, his presence preceding him like the pressure wave from an explosion. Expensive Italian leather shoes clicked against the tile floor with each step, a sound sharp and deliberate as dominoes falling in a line. His suit cost more than Hannah's monthly rent, charcoal grey, tailored in a way that said money and power and the absolute certainty that he deserved both. He was tall, maybe 6'2", the kind of physical presence that made people unconsciously step backward, that made residents straighten their shoulders and drop their eyes when he glanced in their direction. Behind him trailed for medical residents in white coats, their badges identifying them as third-year students, the kind of junior physicians who were supposed to be learning and instead were mostly afraid. Sterling moved through the ward like a man who'd never been questioned, who'd built his reputation on brilliance and brutality in equal measure, who understood that in hospitals like Sacred Heart, fear was an acceptable management tool if it produced results. Hannah had learned to recognize that kind of man because she'd trained alongside his military equivalent, officers who led through intimidation, who created hierarchies based on terror, who believed that the people who questioned them less were the ones worth keeping around. The bet about the church mouse had been his way of establishing that hierarchy, his way of marking territory, his way of testing whether anyone would actually challenge him. The nickname itself was interesting. Church mouse. It meant quiet, timid, religious in the most demeaning sense. It meant harmless. It meant someone you could dismiss without consequence. Sterling had probably thought of it as clever. Probably thought it would stick. Probably didn't realize that his voice carried differently than he believed it did, that sound traveled differently through hospital corridors, that the woman organizing medication charts had ears trained to distinguish the direction of sniper fire at 2,000 yards and could definitely hear every syllable of what he'd just said about her. Hannah finished organizing the charts. 13 of them. All in perfect order. All arranged so the medication interaction checker would flag any conflicts automatically. She turned away from the nurse's station, moved down the corridor toward the med supply room, and nobody who watched her would have seen anything except a quiet nurse doing her job. That was the mask. The mask was the only weapon she needed right now. The morning shifted into its steady rhythm. Vital signs. Medication passes. Patient assessments. Hannah moved through her assignments with the kind of efficiency that made her nearly invisible. The best nurses were the ones people didn't notice, the ones who anticipated problems before they became emergencies. She checked Colonel Reeves in room for 12 with particular attention, his post-surgical cardiac vital steady at 72 beats per minute, his oxygen saturation holding at 98% on room air. She didn't explain why she checked on him more frequently than other post-op patients. She didn't mention that his name was in a file she kept at home, that his medical record had crossed her desk 3 months ago and triggered a cascade of decisions that had brought her to Sacred Heart Hospital in the first place. Some weight you carried alone. Some reasons you kept absolutely silent. She was checking his medication chart when Sterling appeared in the doorway of room for 12, his presence announced by the click of his shoes against the tile and the sudden pressure drop in the air, the way oxygen gets thin when predators enter the room. "Tell me you didn't order a second anticoagulant on this patient," Sterling said. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation wrapped in a command, the kind of statement designed to put her on the defensive before she'd even had the chance to respond. Behind him, one of the residents, a nervous kid named Patterson, maybe 26 years old, shifted his weight and looked at the floor. Hannah held Colonel Reeves' chart in her hands. She looked at the medication list, saw the 2 anticoagulants her eyes had registered the moment she'd reviewed the morning orders. The dosages were wrong. Not dangerously wrong. Not acutely wrong. But wrong. A standard heparin infusion at 18 units per kilogram per hour, which was correct, and then a second order for enoxaparin at 1 milligram per kilogram that should never have been written because the heparin was already providing anticoagulation. Redundant. Excessive. The kind of mistake that got caught by nursing oversight, which was exactly the job Hannah had been hired to do. "The enoxaparin order shouldn't be here," Hannah said. Her voice was quiet. Calm. The kind of voice that came from having given orders in circumstances where hesitation cost lives. The kind of voice that didn't ask permission or beg forgiveness. She turned the chart towards Sterling so he could see the medication list himself. "It's redundant with the heparin. PT would need to check, but dosing this way puts him at risk for bleeding complications. I flagged it for clarification before administering anything." The room went absolutely still. Sterling's jaw tightened. Patterson's eyes went wide. Hannah understood exactly what she'd just done. She'd corrected a senior physician's decision in front of a resident. She'd implied incompetence. She'd violated the unspoken hierarchy where senior doctors didn't make mistakes, or at least not mistakes that got called out in public. Sterling stared at the chart like it had personally betrayed him. His hands clenched into fists, then released. "Check with pharmacy," he said, his voice dropping into the dangerous register of controlled anger. "If you're so certain." He turned and walked out of the room without looking back, the resident scurrying behind him like leaves in a current. Patterson glanced at Hannah on his way out, something that might have been gratitude or might have been fear. She marked the medication query in Colonel Reeves' chart, documented her clinical concern, and continued her rounds. By afternoon, pharmacy had confirmed the error. The enoxaparin order was withdrawn. Sterling never mentioned it again, which meant he'd definitely noticed it, which meant the next 3 months were going to be considerably more complicated than she'd planned. She finished her shift at 1900 hours. Changed out of her scrubs. Opened her locker and looked at the combat boots sitting beneath the neat stack of spare uniforms, their leather catching the fluorescent light like something trapped trying to remember what it felt like to be free. The next afternoon, Hannah carried her lunch tray through the crowded cafeteria at Sacred Heart, chicken soup in a ceramic bowl, saltines on the side, an apple she'd brought from home. The dining room hummed with the usual chaos, residents arguing about cases, nurses comparing shift notes, the smell of institutional food mixing with antiseptic that seemed to seep through every surface of the hospital. She was heading toward the corner table she preferred, the one with a view of the mountains through the western window, when Dr. Sterling stepped directly into her path. He didn't announce himself. Didn't warn her. He simply raised his forearm and knocked the tray upward with the casual precision of someone accustomed to physics bending to his will. The soup cascaded down her scrubs in a hot arc across her chest, her abdomen, soaking through the thin blue fabric in seconds. The bowl clattered across 3 tables before shattering against the tile floor. Crackers scattered like shrapnel. The apple rolled under a chair and stopped against someone's shoe. 50 conversations stopped simultaneously. Every person in that cafeteria turned to watch. Sterling stood there, adjusting his designer cufflinks as though he'd simply swatted away an insect. His white coat was pristine. His expression was pure satisfaction. "Clumsy," he said, loud enough to ensure every witness heard it clearly. "You should watch where you're going." Hannah took one measured breath. The kind of breath she'd taken before extraction operations in Baghdad, when the only thing between success and catastrophe was the space between heartbeats. She felt a single tear escape, not from pain, not from humiliation, but from the effort of remaining still when every fiber of her body wanted to respond with the muscle memory of someone trained to end threats. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact with Sterling. Her eyes were steady. Her voice came out level as a surgeon's hand. "My fault entirely, doctor. I should watch where I'm going." She knelt to collect the debris, soup-soaked napkins, broken ceramic, scattered crackers, while Sterling walked away, his footsteps echoing across the tile with the confidence of a predator who'd just reasserted dominance. The room slowly resumed its conversations, but the energy had shifted. Whispers started. 3 nurses approached to help her, but Hannah waved them off with a small gesture that carried more authority than the words themselves. She cleaned the floor alone, her hand steady, her breathing controlled. Her scrubs were ruined, but her composure remained intact. That was the real victory, the one Sterling hadn't managed to take. But that wasn't the worst part. That evening, Hannah was stationed at the ICU nurses' station, updating the care plan for Colonel Reeves in room for 12. She'd been reviewing his latest lab work, kidney function stable, cardiac markers trending downward, vital signs appropriate for his recovery, when Sterling appeared at the edge of her peripheral vision like a storm system moving across a clear sky. She didn't look up, but she felt him approach. Felt the way the air pressure changed when predators entered a space. He dropped the patient chart directly at her feet. The impact sent papers cascading across the floor, vital signs graphs, lab results, physician notes, all scattering like leaves in October wind. "Pick that up, sweetheart," Sterling said, his voice carrying to every corner of the unit. "Or is bending over too difficult for a church mouse?" The term was precisely calibrated to humiliate. It referenced the sermon analogy he'd made at the nurses' station, suggested physical weakness, implied she was small and insignificant. Around the corner, a resident froze mid-step. 2 nurses at the medication dispensary stopped moving. Even the monitors seemed to quiet, as if the equipment itself was watching to see how she would respond. Hannah knelt slowly. Not quickly, slowly enough to control every movement, to ensure her composure remained visible to everyone watching. She gathered each page with deliberate care, stacking them in proper order, vital signs first, then labs, then physician notes. Her movements were precise, economical, the movements of someone who'd organized supplies under fire and understood that panic was a luxury nobody could afford. Her voice, when she spoke, came from somewhere deeper than her chest, came from the part of her that had held together field hospitals under mortar assault, that had trained for 18 months before her first deployment, that understood the mathematics of survival. "Of course, Doctor. I'd hate for Mr. Reeves to suffer because his chart was on the floor." The words were soft. Deferential. Exactly what Sterling expected to hear. But underneath them ran a current of something else, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand upright even as he smiled his victory. He'd expected tears or anger. Confrontation or submission. What he got instead was a kind of stillness, the stillness of someone who was no longer operating in the emotional register he'd mastered. Sterling straightened the chart in her hands with one finger, the gesture dripping with condescension. "That's better. Much better." He walked toward the elevator, and Hannah watched him go, her hands completely steady, her expression completely neutral. But behind her eyes, something had shifted. The recognition of something Sterling had missed entirely. A person doesn't serve 18 years in special operations without learning that humiliation is only powerful if you grant it power. She placed Colonel Reeves' chart back on the desk and returned to her work. The ICU resumed its rhythms, ventilators whooshing, monitors beeping their steady electronic heartbeat, the fluorescent lights casting everything in that particular shade of institutional white that made it impossible to tell if it was 3 p.m. or 3 a.m. But something had fundamentally changed in the power dynamic Sterling thought he controlled. He'd broken her tray and soaked her scrubs. He'd thrown a patient chart at her feet and called her sweetheart as though she were a subordinate who'd never learned to stand at attention. He'd done everything he could to establish that she was small, powerless, insignificant. And she'd responded with the composure of someone who'd already survived much worse. By that night, Hannah was scrubbing the soup stains out of her work scrubs in her apartment, watching the brown water swirl down the sink. The smell of detergent mixed with something metallic, rust, maybe, or just the memory of it. She hung them to dry and opened her locker at Sacred Heart the next morning to find them already there, cleaned and pressed by the hospital's laundry service. Sterling must have noticed. Must have realized that his chosen method of degradation had simply been absorbed and processed, like the system that had trained her to absorb and process trauma itself. He'd knocked her tray to the floor. He'd thrown a chart at her feet. He'd used words designed to strip away dignity. And she'd remained standing, her voice level, her eyes clear, her hand steady as a surgical laser. He hadn't broken her. He'd shown everyone in that cafeteria and that ICU that there was something fundamentally different about Hannah Clarke. Something Sterling couldn't quite identify or control. And that terrified him far more than if she'd cried or fought back, because at least then he would have understood the rules of engagement. What happened next would prove exactly how much Sterling had underestimated the woman he'd decided to destroy. The monitor alarm shrieked at 2:07 a.m. One long, relentless wail that cut through the ICU like a surgical blade. Hannah's head snapped up from the nurse's station before her conscious mind registered what she was hearing. Room for 12. Colonel Reeves. She moved. No hesitation. No checking the assignment board or calling for backup first. Her feet were already carrying her down the corridor before the second alarm pulse sounded, the fluorescent lights casting everything in that particular shade of hospital white that made blood look black on the monitors. The door to 412 swung open and the numbers on the screen told her everything. Blood pressure dropping. 70/40. 60/30. The jugular veins in Reeves' neck distended like ropes pulled tight beneath his skin. The heart sounds muffled, that dull, distant thump that meant something was compressing the organ from the outside. Pericardial effusion. Cardiac tamponade. The patient's own blood pooling in the sac around his heart like a hand closing slowly into a fist. "Get me an echo machine," Hannah said to the resident standing frozen at the foot of the bed. Not a request. A command that sounded nothing like the deferential nurse Sterling had spent 3 months trying to break. And a crash cart. Now. The resident didn't move. He was staring at the monitor like it might offer him instructions. Hannah's hands were already moving. 18-gauge needle. Sterile field. Her fingers found the space between the 5th and 6th ribs at the midclavicular line with the automatic precision of someone who'd done this under fire in a tent with sand in her hair and mortars landing outside. The muscle memory had never left. Pain is data. Fear is irrelevant. The patient in front of you is the only thing that exists. "I need someone to page Dr. Sterling," she said, not looking up from the needle in her hand. "Tell him it's an emergency. If he doesn't answer, keep paging." The needle slid in. Through skin. Through fascia. She felt the give, that subtle resistance change that meant she'd entered the pericardial sac. The dark blood that followed was almost black in the fluorescent light, pooling slowly into the syringe like something alive and dangerous. 10 milliliters. 20. 30. The monitor numbers climbed. 80/50. 90/60. The muffled heart sound sharpened as the pressure released and the organ could expand again. Reeves' eyes fluttered open, his hand reaching for hers without conscious thought, the way drowning people reach for anything solid. "You're okay," Hannah said, and her voice had dropped an octave, lower, steadier, the voice of someone who'd held dying people through the night and made them believe they would see morning. "Stay still. You had a bleed into your pericardium. I'm draining it. You're going to be fine." The resident finally moved. Then another nurse arrived. Then someone, she didn't register who, was asking her questions she answered without breaking focus. Vital signs stabilizing. O2 sat climbing. Sinus rhythm returning. By the time the echocardiogram arrived, Colonel Reeves was breathing on his own, his hand still gripping hers like she was the only solid thing in a collapsing world. The emergency was over. What happened next would be worse. At 7:03 a.m., Dr. Sterling walked into the ICU with a cup of coffee that had cost more than Hannah's hourly wage and a manila folder that he opened with the careful precision of a man handling evidence. His eye scanned the overnight documentation, every line of which detailed exactly what Hannah had done. The time. The procedure. The patient outcome. Her signature at the bottom of every entry, each letter perfectly formed, unafraid. His face went carefully neutral. That was worse than anger. That was calculation. His fingers tightened on the chart, the knuckles whitening, and Hannah watched him read the same 3 paragraphs twice, processing not just what she'd done but what it meant, that she'd saved a patient without him. That she'd moved with authority. That she'd spoken in commands and the residents had obeyed her. He closed the folder. "My office. Now." The walk to his office took 30 seconds. The mahogany desk dominated the space like a throne, framed credentials covering one wall, medical school, board certifications, fellowship certificates from Johns Hopkins and the Mayo Clinic. Outside the window, Denver sprawled in the early morning light, indifferent to the machinery of human ambition being deployed behind glass on the 14th floor. Sterling Saturday. Hannah remained standing. That was a choice. Not defiant. Just fact. He picked up his phone without looking at her. The first call went to Dr. Patricia Weinstein, the chief of medicine, and his voice was smooth as warm oil. "Patricia, good morning. I need to discuss a situation with one of our nursing staff. There was an unauthorized invasive procedure performed on a patient in the ICU last night. A pericardiocentesis. No physician present. Scope of practice violation." He paused, listening, his jaw working slightly. "I'm concerned about liability. Credential verification. Yes. I think we should move quickly on this." He hung up and immediately dialed again. "Richard. It's James Sterling. I need you to contact Sacred Heart's nursing school records. One of our staff nurses appears to have misrepresented her credentials or background." "Yes. I'll send you her file. This is time-sensitive." He hung up before Richard could ask questions. The third call came to someone named Michelle Torres. "Michelle, I have a situation that requires your expertise. I need a comprehensive review of a nurse's patient interactions. Possible credential issues. Possible scope of practice violations. I'll email you everything within the hour." "Yes. Before she leaves the hospital today if possible." He hung up. Looked at her for the first time. "You're suspended pending investigation," Sterling said, his voice carrying the weight of institutional power, not just his power, but the power he'd activated with those 3 phone calls. Board members. Investigators. Lawyers probably already being called. Clean out your locker and surrender your badge to security. Someone from HR will contact you within 24 hours regarding the formal investigation." Hannah didn't respond. The composure she'd maintained since the 2 a.m. alarm didn't crack. Not a tremor in her hands. Not a change in her breathing. But inside, something was collapsing like a structure designed to stand for a specific weight finally receiving more than it was built to bear. She walked to the changing room at 7:11 a.m. The lockers stood in neat metal rows under the harsh fluorescent lights that hummed their constant electric lament. Her locker opened with the same key it always had, revealing the small geography of her civilian life: spare scrubs folded on the top shelf, family photos on the interior of the door, a half-empty bottle of ibuprofen, and at the bottom, the worn combat boots. The leather had faded from military tan to something closer to the color of old bone. The laces were frayed. The soles were scuffed from concrete and sand from places she'd promised herself she'd forgotten. But you don't forget. You carry it. You bury it under a name that isn't yours and a job that doesn't require you to remember, and you pretend the weight isn't there until something like this happens and you realize the pretending was always just another kind of lying. She put the boots in the cardboard box with her spare scrubs and the 3 framed photos, one of her and Marcus at their wedding in 2002, before the first deployment. One of David as a child, gap-toothed and grinning, before she'd missed 3 years of his childhood watching him grow up in phone calls and emails. One of her unit in Baghdad in 2009, 14 soldiers in front of a sandbag tent, all of them alive in the photograph, only 7 still alive in the present tense. The security guard was Marcus, a young man in his mid-20s who'd always been kind to her during those early morning shifts when she'd arrive exhausted and he'd smile without asking why. His eyes were apologetic when she handed him the box, like he was somehow responsible for the architecture of institutional power that had decided she was dangerous. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I hope this gets sorted out." Hannah nodded. She couldn't speak. Not because of emotion, she'd learned to compartmentalize emotion in places where emotion got people killed, but because if she opened her mouth, she might say something that would make this worse. Something that would confirm Sterling's suspicions. Something that would confirm that hiding a senior chief petty officer under the identity of a quiet nurse had been exactly as unsustainable as she'd always known it would be. She walked toward the exit with the cardboard box in her arms, the weight of those combat boots pressing against her chest like a promise she'd broken. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was waiting in the ER, where a trauma patient had just arrived, a gunshot wound victim who would need hands that knew how to save lives under pressure. And Hannah Clarke, the one person in the hospital qualified for the work ahead, would not be there to do it. The suspension letter came in an envelope. Hannah held it for 7 minutes before opening it, sitting in her car in the Sacred Heart parking lot, watching the rain streak the windshield. Pending investigation into unauthorized procedures and misrepresented credentials, it read. Effective immediately. Your hospital badge has been deactivated. She walked back inside anyway. Not to work. Just to the locker room on the 3rd floor, the one nobody used anymore since they'd renovated the East Wing. Her locker, number 247, same one for 3 months, opened with a click. 3 pairs of scrubs. A fleece jacket. Hand lotion. And at the bottom, wrapped in a faded army t-shirt, the pair of worn combat boots. She lifted them out slowly. The leather was cracked from a decade of desert sun. The laces were frayed. The sole of the left boot had a small tear where shrapnel had caught it in Fallujah, back when she was someone else entirely. Someone with a different name, different rank, different life. The boots had sat in this locker every single day, hidden beneath her civilian clothes, a reminder she couldn't afford to forget and couldn't afford to show. Hannah held them to her chest like an accusation. She'd packed everything else into a cardboard box, the kind security gives you when they walk you out. The boots she carried in her hands. She didn't put them in the box. Boxes could be thrown away. These boots were part of her bones. That night she drove to Riverside Cemetery in the rain. The grave was in the northeast corner, beneath a Colorado blue spruce that had grown another 3 feet since the last time she'd been here. 18 months ago. Before David called with news of his deployment. Before she'd taken the nursing position at Sacred Heart, before Sterling, before any of this. The headstone read Lieutenant Commander Marcus Clarke, 1978 to 2018. Beloved husband. Devoted father. Hannah knelt in the mud. The rain was cold, hammering down like it had something to prove. Water ran down her face and she didn't bother separating it from tears anymore. Let them mix. What was the difference? I failed again, Marcus, she whispered. Her voice didn't break. That would come later, in private. Right now she just stated facts, like she was debriefing a superior officer. I couldn't stay hidden. Couldn't just be normal. Couldn't protect our son from knowing his mother is still that broken soldier who can't even tell him where she's been. The rain intensified. Thunder rolled across the cemetery like distant mortar fire. For days, she continued, her hands gripping the combat boot so tightly her knuckles went white. For days sitting in that apartment, David calling, not answering, sitting in the dark trying to figure out how to explain why I failed at the one thing I was supposed to do. Be invisible. Be ordinary. Be a nurse, not a. She couldn't finish the sentence. Couldn't say what she actually was. Some words, once spoken aloud at a grave, become real in a way they weren't before. The suspension lasted 4 days. For days of Hannah's phone dark except for work emails and news alerts. For days of her sitting in her apartment in a neighborhood where nobody knew her name, where the neighbors thought she was divorced, where David's calls went to voicemail because she couldn't figure out how to explain Sterling's suspension letter or the investigation or why his mother, his normal, quiet mother who brought casseroles to PTA meetings, had saved a patient in a way that required expertise nobody was supposed to ask about. On the 5th day, at 2:41 p.m., her phone buzzed with a text from a former colleague at Sacred Heart, a trauma nurse named Jennifer who'd never asked too many questions. You need to get here. Now. ER. Bring your ID. Hannah almost didn't go. The suspended badge wouldn't scan. She'd be turned away at security. But Jennifer wouldn't text unless it was bad. Jennifer only texted about gunshot wounds and mass casualty events. The ER was controlled chaos when Hannah arrived. A GSW patient, critical condition, bleeding out despite 2 lines and a massive transfusion protocol running at full speed. The patient, a man in his late 30s, dark eyes, skin the color of wet concrete, was thrashing against restraints, screaming in Arabic, fighting the ventilator tube they'd placed to manage his airway. Security was struggling to keep him still while the trauma attending tried to assess the damage. 2 entries, she could see. At least 1 exit wound in the abdomen. Spinal involvement possible. His hands were shaking, not from blood loss but from something deeper. Terror. Hannah moved forward instinctively, her suspended credentials meaningless against the simple fact that a patient was drowning in his own fear. She stepped to the bedside and switched to Arabic, her voice dropping to the soft certainty she'd learned in field hospitals where panic was contagious. I'm here. You're safe. Tell me where it hurts most. The patient's eyes found her face. They locked. His body went rigid. Al-Sayyida al-Maut, he whispered. The words came out like a prayer to something darker than God. The Lady of Death. Baghdad. 2009, you were there. At the black site, you. Security pulled him back. The patient fought them, his voice rising, mixing English and Arabic in a stream of panicked recognition. 3 nurses had heard. 2 security guards. The ER attending who was already reaching for his phone, probably to call administration about the suspended nurse who'd just identified herself to a detainee through classified association. But that was secondary now. Because the trauma bay doors burst open with the sound of a chair scraping tile, and a voice, raw, animal, broken, screamed something incoherent about insurgents and IEDs and blood. A man stood in the doorway. 6'5". 240 pounds. Desert camouflage still hanging on him like a skin he couldn't shed. His pupils blown wide. His hand shaking with adrenaline or methamphetamine or both. Where are they? He screamed. Where are the insurgents? I have to. A nurse tried to approach him gently. His hand came up and caught her by the throat, lifting her off the ground like she weighed nothing. Her feet kicked uselessly. Her fingers clawed at his arm. Her face went the color of a stopped heart. Security moved forward. He swatted them aside with his free arm, the casual violence of someone who'd been trained to kill and couldn't turn it off. His size made him nearly untouchable. His training made him unstoppable. Hannah moved. Not toward the exit. Not toward security. Toward him. For strides across the tile floor. She caught his extended arm at the wrist and elbow, and muscle memory took over like flipping a switch. She pivoted her hips, using his own momentum to torque his elbow joint past its breaking point. The nurse dropped to the ground, gasping. The man bellowed, tried to adapt his stance, tried to use his size advantage. Hannah swept his legs, not with force but with geometry, the exact angle that converted his height from an asset to a liability. He went down face first into the tile with Hannah's knee on his spine, her hand controlling his arm in a position that made resistance extremely inadvisable. For seconds. Start to finish. The entire emergency room froze. 30 people stood motionless, watching a 140-pound woman in cheap scrubs effortlessly subdue an attacker twice her size with movements that belonged in a different theater of war entirely. The attacker wasn't moving. Wasn't breathing heavily. Wasn't anything but compliant, because compliance was the only option left. The silence stretched like pulled taffy. Then a voice cut through it, "Mom." Hannah's head snapped up. Standing in the ER entrance, in the dress blue uniform of the United States Navy, his shoulders identical to his father's, his eyes exactly like hers, David. Her son. 18 months since she'd seen him in person. 2 weeks since she'd heard his voice on a phone call she'd been too much of a coward to answer properly. Mom, i.e. his face was going through expressions too quickly to follow. Shock. Confusion. The first horrible dawning of understanding. Senior Chief Petty Officer. The Iraqi patient took one look at Hannah escorting security and his entire body went rigid. His face drained of color. His lips moved in rapid, terrified Arabic, the words tumbling over each other like he was drowning. Al-Sayyida al-Mort. Al-Sayyida al-Mort. The Lady of Death. Baghdad 2009. The ER fell silent. Hannah's hands found the patient's chart. Her fingers trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of names she'd spent 7 years burying. Nasreen. Amira. The 3 children from the Market District. Colonel Reeves' voice during extraction, "That's our window." 10 minutes. Move. Her lips moved silently over each name as she read the file, her jaw clenching once, then releasing. The composure held. It always held. But her hands told a different story. They shook like leaves in a storm wind as she gripped the metal clipboard. One of the residents whispered to another, "Who is?" The ER doors burst open. David appeared in full dress uniform, his face flushed, his voice shaking with something that wasn't anger but couldn't quite be called anything else. Mom. Senior Chief Petty Officer. The question hung in the fluorescent lit air like a challenge and a confession and a desperate plea all at once. His eyes locked on hers, searching for something he'd never seen before, something his entire childhood had been constructed to hide from him. Hannah set down the chart. She looked at her son, really looked at him, and something inside her chest fractured silently. The glass doors opened again. And again. And again. They came in formation, 12 men in dress blues, their uniforms crisp as fresh bandages. They're bearing the kind of precision that only comes from years of operating in environments where mistakes cost lives. David's entire SEAL team. They moved across the tile floor in synchronized steps, boots striking the ground like a drumbeat counting down to something momentous, something that couldn't be taken back. The lead officer, his commander, Hannah recognized immediately, stepped forward. His voice carried the weight of institutional authority, the kind that made hospital administrators listen, that made civilians instinctively step back. Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke, Navy Cross, 2 silver stars, Purple Heart. He paused, letting each word settle into the air like sediment in still water. The gathered staff had gone completely motionless. A monitor beeped somewhere in the distance, the only sound in a room where even the fluorescent light seemed to hold their humming breath. She extracted 17 hostages under fire in Baghdad, 2009. Tactical extraction of non-combatants while managing active hostile fire from 3 separate positions. The commander's voice continued, steady as a Black Hawk rotor, 36 hours. Single-handed field hospital operation against enemy assault. No casualties among the civilians under her care. None. An FBI liaison stepped forward next, his credentials already in hand, his expression the particular blankness of federal employees revealing classified information they'd never wanted to declassify. Senior Chief Clarke was part of a joint task force operating under JSOC authority. Her service record is sealed, her operational details remain classified at the highest level, but I can tell you that her actions in theater saved more than 400 civilians across 8 separate operations. He glanced at Sterling, who stood frozen near the nurse's station, his face the color of old bone. The United States government has been protecting her location for 7 years. This reveal was not supposed to happen at this hospital. Sterling's jaw moved silently. No words came out. The hospital administrator, Dr. Patricia Weinstein, appeared as if summoned by the collective will of the assembled SEALs. Her heels clicked against the tile with the precision of a metronome counting down to execution. She took in the scene, the uniforms, the FBI liaison, Hannah standing with her shoulders back and her eyes forward, no longer the quiet nurse but something else entirely, something that had been waiting 7 years to take up space in the world again. Weinstein's voice, when she spoke, carried no warmth. "Dr. Sterling, my office." Immediately. He moved like a man walking through water that had turned to tar. His expensive shoes, Italian leather, probably $3,000, scraped against the floor with a sound like fingernails on slate. He tried to pass Hannah. He didn't look at her. He looked through her, as if she had become invisible now that her identity had been revealed, as if acknowledging her existence would somehow make the last 3 months real instead of the elaborate professional mistake it clearly was. Security guard Marcus, the same Marcus who'd handed Hannah her belongings box during the suspension, stepped forward. He held a cardboard box identical to the one Hannah had carried out of this building 4 days prior. Sterling's nameplate was printed on the side. His office key lay on top of the contents, separated from everything else like an excommunication. "I believe you know the way out," Marcus said flatly, his voice like gravel mixed with finality. Sterling took the box without speaking. His face had moved past pale into something almost transparent, as if all the blood had drained out of him and collected somewhere beneath the floor. He walked toward the exit, and no one moved to stop him, no one spoke, no one acknowledged his passage except to step slightly aside to let him through, the way a crowd parts for something that should no longer be counted among the living. The doors closed behind him. The investigation took 3 weeks. Phone records. Board meeting minutes. Testimony from 4 other nurses who'd been managed with the same combination of brilliance and brutality that Sterling had perfected over 17 years at Sacred Heart. The evidence was overwhelming, a paper trail of professional retaliation so clear that even Sterling's lawyers advised immediate settlement to avoid a lawsuit that would have exposed him to criminal investigation. His medical privileges were permanently revoked. His reputation, once impeccable, became synonymous with abuse of power. The settlement prevented him from suing for wrongful termination, which meant he couldn't even fight back in the one arena where he might have had leverage. 6 months later, Hannah stood in her restored office, the same space she'd occupied before the suspension, now with something new on the desk. Her combat boots, worn and weathered from Baghdad dust, sat in the center of the blotter where her coffee cup used to be. No one questioned their presence anymore. No one made jokes or sideways comments. The boots were part of her story now, as visible as her nameplate, as permanent as the commission on her wall that had been waiting for this moment since the day she'd signed it. David's wedding invitation arrived on a Tuesday, cream-colored paper with navy lettering. David Clarke and Jennifer Martinez, requesting the honor of her presence at their wedding. The location made her smile, Sacred Heart Chapel, the small church attached to the hospital, the building that had become the center of everything. 2 Saturdays later, Hannah attended a charity event in the hospital's conference room, dressed in civilian clothes, standing near the coffee station when she overheard 2 residents talking in careful, professional whispers about a recent encounter at the strip mall on South Federal Boulevard. Dr. Sterling, sitting at a folding table between a tax preparation service and a discount cell phone kiosk, selling supplemental insurance in a suit that cost approximately $70 and hung on his frame like drapes hung on a skeleton. One resident laughed, harsh and quick, the sound of schadenfreude barely disguised. The other looked uncomfortable, the way people do when they witness the complete dissolution of someone they once feared. Hannah felt nothing at all, not satisfaction, not pity, just the quiet recognition that gravity worked the same way for everyone, that what goes up eventually comes down, that some falls take longer than others but were inevitable from the moment they began. She left the event early and drove home through Denver traffic that moved like blood through veins, the city alive and indifferent to any single person's reckoning. David's wedding came 2 months later, on a Friday in September when the Colorado air had that particular clarity that comes right before the seasons change. Hannah wore her dress uniform for the first time in 7 years, the blue fabric crisp against her skin, her ribbons and medals arranged in order of precedence across her chest. The Navy Cross, the highest award for valor a non-commissioned officer could receive, hung beneath her left collarbone like a statement of fact no one could argue with anymore. David's eyes filled with tears when he saw her walk into the chapel. He mouthed thank you before turning to face Jennifer, and Hannah understood that he wasn't thanking her for coming. He was thanking her for being alive. For being real. For being someone he could finally know. During the reception, held in the hospital's grand ballroom, a young nurse approached Hannah as she stood watching her son dance with his new wife. The nurse was young, maybe 24, with the careful posture of someone still learning how to take up space in a hospital hierarchy that hadn't yet taught her she was allowed to. Senior Chief Clarke. Her voice was soft, trembling slightly. I just started on your floor. I wanted to say, you're the reason I'm not afraid anymore. Of doctors. Of authority. Of speaking up when something's wrong. Hannah squeezed her hand, and in that moment she saw herself 7 years ago, terrified and hidden and slowly dying inside the prison of invisibility she'd constructed. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns, Hannah said quietly, and meant it with everything she'd kept buried and everything she'd finally let surface. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If you've been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, subscribe and share this story with someone who needs to know they're stronger than they've been allowed to show. Comment below, have you ever been completely wrong about someone?